There are beliefs that survive not because they are true, but because they are rarely examined. Christianity is not one of these by accident. It has endured for 2,000 years partly through intellectual resources, yes, but also through a careful positioning that places certain questions outside the bounds of ordinary reasoning. To ask whether the system is internally coherent is almost treated as a category-error confusion of faith with analysis, as if the two could never occupy the same space. But they can, and should. What follows is not an argument that Christians are foolish. It is an argument that the conceptual architecture of Christian theology contains fractures so fundamental that they cannot be resolved without abandoning the core claims. I do not arrive at this through atheist rhetoric or moral critique. I arrive at it through the method Baruch Spinoza demonstrated, by taking beliefs seriously enough to examine their logical structure, by assuming they mean what they say, and by following the implications wherever they lead. This is harder than mockery. It requires patience, but it also requires honesty. Christianity makes specific, testable claims about reality. God exists as a conscious, intentional being. He created the universe at a particular moment in time. He is all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. He intervenes in human affairs. He became human in one person at one moment in history. He demands worship and obedience. He judges human beings and determines their eternal fate. These are not metaphors or symbolic truths available only to the enlightened. They are presented as facts about how the world actually is. To say it's just a metaphor is to abandon Christianity as traditionally understood. A metaphor for what exactly? For some vague spiritual feeling? That is not what believers have claimed. Believers have staked their lives, their children's educations, their entire moral frameworks on these propositions being literally true. So let us take them as stated. Let us not retreat into ambiguity when examined. Let us see whether they can all be true together. The first problem: divine omniscience and human freedom. Start with a simple observation. God knows, before the foundation of the world, every choice you will ever make. Not merely that He foresees them, that He actually knows them. He knows them eternally, not in time, but in the peculiar way the Christian tradition claims God exists outside time while still knowing everything within it. If God knows with certainty that you will commit a sin next Tuesday, then next Tuesday you cannot fail to commit that sin. Not because God forced you, but because God knows means the thing is already determined. To say God knows but you could still do otherwise is to say the sin is both necessary and contingent, both known and genuinely open. These are not two perspectives on the same fact. They are contradictions. The Christian response that God exists outside time and therefore sees all moments simultaneously does not solve the problem. It merely restates it in different language. If God eternally sees your sin is eternally actual, not merely possible. You cannot be free in any meaningful sense if your actions are fixed in God's eternal vision. This is not merely about God's foreknowledge. It is about the very concept of logical necessity. If the future is fully known by an omniscient being, then it is not future. It is actual. And what is actual cannot be otherwise. The second problem: omniscience and the structure of knowledge. But there is a deeper problem lurking beneath the first. For God to know something, that thing must be knowable. And for a thing to be knowable, it must have a determinate nature. It must be what it is, not what it might be. Consider, can God know a contradiction? Can God know that a square circle exists? No, because the proposition contains no knowledge to possess. It is empty. A square circle is not a possible thing that God happens not to create. It is a logical impossibility. Now extend this. Can God know the future choices of a free agent? Only if those choices have a determinate nature in God's omniscient knowledge. But if they have a determinate nature, if they are knowable, then they are not free. Freedom requires genuine alternative possibilities. Knowledge of freedom is a contradiction. You cannot know what a free being will do before they do it, because if you know it, they will do it necessarily, not freely. The Christian tradition tries to escape this by claiming that God's knowledge is middle knowledge, knowledge of what free creatures would freely choose in any circumstance. But this does not solve the problem. It only relocates it. If God knows what you would freely choose, then given the circumstances, you will choose it. The knowledge is still prior to and determining of the fact. Either God knows the future and humans are not free, or humans are genuinely free, and God does not know the future. These are not optional conclusions. They follow from the meanings of the terms. The third problem, omnipotence and logic. God can do anything is a statement so familiar that its incoherence passes unnoticed. Can God create a stone so heavy he cannot lift it? The question sounds clever, even trivial. But it points to something serious. Omnipotence cannot mean the power to do logically contradictory things. If omnipotence includes the power to do what is logically impossible, then omnipotence is not a coherent concept at all. It becomes empty. Logical laws are not external constraints imposed on God. They are the structure of possibility itself. To violate them is not to do something, it is to do nothing while calling it something. But here is where the Christian claim collapses entirely. Christian theology does not merely ask God to exceed physical or natural laws. It asks God to violate logical laws constantly. It asks him to be one being and three beings simultaneously. It asks him to be immutable and incarnate, timeless and historical, omniscient and responsive to prayer. These are not gaps between divine power and physical reality. They are contradictions. The Christian response that these are mysteries beyond human understanding is an admission of incoherence, not a defense of it. A mystery is something we do not yet understand. A contradiction is something that cannot be understood because it violates the structure of intelligibility itself. These are not the same thing. The fourth problem, the problem of evil. This one has been rehearsed so often that it is easy to dismiss. But the standard formulation obscures the logical depth of the problem. If God is omnipotent, he can prevent evil. If God is omniscient, he knew evil would occur. If God is morally perfect, he would want to prevent evil. If all three are true, then evil should not exist. Yet it does. The stock responses fail in instructive ways. Evil is the absence of good merely relabels the problem without solving it. An omnipotent God could create beings that freely choose good without creating a world where innocent children die of cancer. The absence of good in their final hours is still something God permitted, knowing in advance it would occur, possessing the power to prevent it. God allows evil to create the possibility of virtue, assumes that virtue is impossible without the contrast of suffering. But this is historically false and logically weaker. An omnipotent God could create beings capable of virtue without requiring that virtue emerge only through the experience of innocent suffering. The argument confuses a pedagogical necessity in our world with a logical necessity in all possible worlds. God works in mysterious ways is not a theodicy. It is a retreat from theodicy. It concedes that no coherent explanation exists. And there is the deeper problem. Even if we grant that some evil serves some purpose, the amount of evil far exceeds what any proposed purpose requires. If free will is the goal, God could have created a world with freedom and far less suffering. If moral development is the goal, similar creatures with similar capacities exist in universes with less pain. The sheer magnitude of unnecessary suffering, the fact that millions of people suffer in ways that produce no virtue, no growth, no redemption cannot be reconciled with a God who is both omnipotent and good. The fifth problem, divine justice and eternal punishment. The Christian claim is that God judges souls and assigns them to eternal punishment or eternal reward based on their choices in a finite lifetime. Several logical problems emerge immediately. First, temporal infinity cannot be a just response to temporal choice. A human life lasts at most 80 or 100 years. The crimes committed within it, however grave, are committed by a finite being in finite time with finite knowledge of consequences. To assign infinite punishment is to violate all principles of proportionality. No serious system of justice punishes a finite offense with infinite penalty. Only arbitrary power does this. Second, God designed the human mind with limited rationality, limited foresight, limited moral development. Many people are born into conditions of poverty, ignorance, and abuse that severely constrain their choices. To hold them equally culpable for their decisions as you hold yourself is not justice. It is the judgment of a being who created the very constraints that limited their freedom, then punishes them for failing to exceed those constraints. Third, repentance on a deathbed is accepted as sufficient for salvation in the Christian system. But this reveals the incoherence of the entire scheme. If a person can commit decades of cruelty and then be forgiven through an 11th-hour conversion, then the punishment in hell is not about justice. Justice would punish the action. Eternal punishment for a finite being's finite crime, followed immediately by forgiveness, if the crime is regretted, this is not a system of justice. It is a system of arbitrary power dressed in the language of justice. An omniscient God would not need to wait for a deathbed conversion to know whether someone was truly repentant. Such a God would know in advance whether the conversion would be genuine. If the conversion is known in advance, then the person's eternal fate is determined before they make the choice to repent. We are back to the problem of omniscience and freedom. The sixth problem, the incarnation. Christianity claims that God became human, not partially, fully. Jesus Christ was fully God and fully human, two complete natures in one person. This is the doctrine of the incarnation, and it violates basic logical laws. A thing cannot be two contrary things at once in the same respect. God is immutable, infinite, incorporeal, eternal. A human being is mutable, finite, corporeal, temporal. These are not surface differences. They are the fundamental categories of being. An immutable being cannot change. A human being changes constantly physically, mentally, emotionally. A human being is literally composed of different matter from moment to moment. God, as traditionally defined, is pure being, identical with himself eternally. These are not two perspectives on the same reality. They are contradictory. A being cannot be both omniscient, knowing all things eternally, and finite in knowledge, learning new things, being surprised, asking questions. The Gospels depict Jesus asking questions, learning, being surprised by faith and by betrayal. But an omniscient being cannot genuinely ask a question. To ask a question is to seek information you do not possess. An omniscient being possesses all information. The only way to reconcile this is to say Jesus' omniscience was somehow suspended or hidden while he was incarnate. But an omniscient being cannot suspend omniscience without ceasing to be omniscient. You cannot be partially omniscient. Either you know or you do not. The traditional response is that Jesus had two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, and that these operated according to their own principles. But this is word magic. If Jesus was fully God, he was omniscient and immutable. If he was fully human, he was finite and changing. You cannot escape contradiction by saying the contradictory properties belong to different natures. They belong to the same person. And a person cannot be both omniscient and finite. This is not a mystery to be revered. It is an incoherence to be admitted. The seventh problem, the Trinity. God is one and God is three. The Christian tradition insists on both. The Father is fully God. The Son is fully God. The Holy Spirit is fully God. Yet they are not three gods but one God. This violates the laws of identity and number. If x equals one God and y equals one God, then y equals x. But the Father is not the Son. Therefore, by the laws of logic, they cannot both be the one God. You can call this a mystery. You can say it transcends reason. But these are admissions of contradiction, not solutions to it. The standard analogy is water in its three states: solid, liquid, gas. But water in the solid state is not water in the liquid state at the same moment. They are sequential. Moreover, all three are water, the same substance in different forms. This is precisely the opposite of the Trinity as traditionally formulated. The Trinity claims that three distinct persons are one substance, not that one substance has three forms. Another analogy: an egg has a shell, a white, and a yolk. But the egg is not the shell, and the shell is not the yolk, though they are all part of the egg. This is partialism, which Christian theology explicitly rejects. God is not composed of parts. There is no coherent way to say that three entities are one entity in the same sense. This is not a deep truth beyond reason. It is a statement that violates reason, and stating it over and over with increasing solemnity does not change this fact. The eighth problem: moral authority and divine command. Christianity claims that God is the source of all morality. What is good is what God commands. What is evil is what God forbids. But this creates a logical problem that Spinoza saw clearly. Either something is good because God commands it, or God commands it because it is good. If the first, then morality is arbitrary. Whatever God commanded would be good. If God commanded that we torture children, torturing children would be good simply by virtue of God's command. This makes morality meaningless. Good becomes a mere label for whatever the powerful will. If the second, then goodness is independent of God's will. Goodness exists as a standard by which even God can be judged. But then God is not the ultimate source of morality. God is subject to it. The Christian tradition tries to escape this dilemma by claiming that God's nature is goodness itself. But this does not help. If God's nature is goodness, then goodness is not dependent on God's will. God cannot choose to be anything other than good. God cannot change the nature of goodness. This means goodness is not created by God. It is an eternal standard to which God himself is subject. In that case, what is actually ultimate? Not God. Goodness. And you could believe in goodness without believing in God. You could explain all human moral intuitions, all moral progress, all moral reasoning without reference to a divine commander. The ninth problem: the problem of particular providence. Christianity claims that God cares about individual humans and intervenes in their lives. He answers prayers. He guides events toward particular outcomes. Yet he supposedly does this while being omniscient, omnipotent, and having created a universe with fixed laws. If the universe operates according to fixed natural laws, then God cannot intervene without violating those laws or having built the intervention into creation from the beginning. If he built it in, then the universe is deterministic, and there is no genuine intervention, only the unfolding of a program God set in motion. If God can violate the laws, then either the laws are not truly universal, in which case science is undermined, or God is constantly performing miracles that we never notice, which is not a meaningful claim. Moreover, if God is omniscient, he knew before creation that you would pray for something, and he knew whether he would grant it. Your prayer is not actually a request. It is a statement of a fact he already knew, uttered in time. If he grants it, he was always going to grant it. If he refuses, he was always going to refuse. In what sense is this responsive to your request? And the deeper problem: millions of people pray for the same thing. Some prayers are answered, some are not. The pattern of answered prayers correlates perfectly with natural probability. People in wealthy nations with access to medical care recover from illnesses. People without such access do not. If God intervened in response to prayer, we would expect to see prayers answered in violation of natural probability: the poor healed without medicine, the lost found against odds, the scientifically impossible made actual. Instead, we see prayers' effects exactly match what you would expect if God does not intervene at all, and the universe operates by fixed laws. The 10th problem: the meaning of resurrection. Christianity claims that Jesus rose from the dead and that this guarantees the future resurrection of all believers. But the claim is incoherent. A corpse is matter organized in a particular way. When that organization breaks down, there is no corpse anymore. The matter disperses. If Jesus' body literally rose, if the matter that had been organized as his corpse became organized as a living body again, where did the energy come from? The second law of thermodynamics forbids such organization without external energy input. God could supply that energy, yes. But then God has performed a violation of natural law that we can actually trace and verify. Instead, the Gospel accounts describe a resurrection that is both physical and somehow not quite physical. The risen Jesus appears in locked rooms and is not initially recognized. He can eat food, but it is unclear if this is necessary for his life. His body is continuous with the pre-resurrection body. He has the same scars, but he is somehow different, veiled, other. This is not a resurrection. It is a confused attempt to have a spiritual rebirth and a bodily resurrection at the same time to maintain both that Jesus conquered death physically and that something non-physical happened. If resurrection is literal, it violates natural law and requires miracle. If resurrection is spiritual, if it is merely saying that Jesus' teaching lived on or his spirit endured, then it is not resurrection at all in the sense that would comfort believers facing death. And if millions of bodies are literally resurrected at the end of time, where will they fit? How will matter be reorganized to bring back billions of bodies? These sound like trivial questions, but they point to something serious. The doctrine is not fully imagined even by those who believe it. The 11th problem: historical contingency and eternal significance. Christianity claims that certain events, the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus, have cosmic and eternal significance. These are historical events that occurred at a particular place and time. They occurred 2,000 years ago in the Near East. But here is the logical problem. If God is eternal and creates the universe, then God has always known that these events would occur. In fact, by some interpretations, God intended them before creation. The death of Jesus is not a response to human sin that occurred after the fact. It is something that God designed and built into creation from the beginning, something that occurred because God eternally willed it. In what sense, then, is it a sacrifice? A sacrifice requires that something of value is given up at a cost. But if God always intended this event, it is not a sacrifice to God. It is a predetermined element of the plan, like an actor sacrificing a prop he owns during a play. And if God caused the event to occur, if God designed human nature, knowing that humans would sin, created Satan knowing Satan would rebel, and designed Jesus' death as the necessary solution, then humans and Satan are not responsible for the sin that Jesus' death supposedly atones for. God is responsible. An omniscient, omnipotent God does not experience genuine surprise, cost, or loss. So the death of Jesus cannot be a genuine sacrifice for God. It can only be a symbolic one, a theatrical arrangement meant to look like a sacrifice without being one. The 12th problem: the meaninglessness of worship. If God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he does not need anything from you. He cannot be lonely, incomplete, or in need of companionship. He cannot benefit from your praise or suffer from your indifference. Worship, in a standard sense, is an attempt to please or honor someone, to give them what they lack, to improve their condition, or express your gratitude for their benefit to you. But an omniscient God needs no one's gratitude expressed to him in the future, because he eternally knows what you will think of him. An omnipotent God needs no one's help. A perfect God cannot be flattered or pleased in a way that improves him. What meaning remains to worship? Only this: you are commanded to pretend that being worshipped matters to God when it cannot matter to him. You are performing a charade, not a relationship. You are either deceiving yourself or participating in a mutual agreement to engage in symbolic behavior that everyone understands to be ultimately empty. Unless, and this is the unstated premise, worship is really about what it does for you, not what it does for God. Worship makes you feel smaller, more connected, more purposeful. But then you are not actually worshiping God. You are using the idea of God to manipulate your own psychology. You could achieve the same effect through meditation, through nature, through philosophy. God becomes unnecessary. Only the feeling remains. It would be comforting to conclude that only the stupid or ignorant believe in Christianity. But this is false and intellectually lazy. Brilliant philosophers, theologians, and scientists have been and are Christian. To understand why requires taking seriously the conditions that make belief possible. First, Christianity was not invented as a logical system. It emerged from religious experience, from community, from narrative and tradition. It was only later that intellectuals attempted to make it rational. But you cannot retrofit logical coherence onto claims that are fundamentally incoherent. This is why Christian theology consists largely of attempts to explain why apparent contradictions are not really contradictions: theodesis, Trinitarian logic, theories of omniscience that escape determinism. Second, human beings are motivated by more than logic. We seek meaning, community, structure, hope. Christianity provides all of these powerfully. A person who has found genuine community and real meaning in the church has an enormous incentive to defend its claims, even if those claims do not withstand scrutiny. The cost of admitting the system is incoherent is the loss of everything that gives their life shape. Third, the traditions has rhetorical and institutional power. For 2,000 years, Christianity has employed the greatest minds to defend it, to explain it, to make it seem more rational than it is. This vast philosophical apparatus can confuse even careful thinkers into believing that the problems have been solved when they have only been obscured by sophisticated language. Fourth, people are trained from childhood to consider certain questions off limits. To question the incarnation or the Trinity is presented not as honest inquiry, but as spiritual rebellion. The barriers to rigorous examination are not intellectual but cultural and emotional. By the time a person is capable of logic, they have internalized the framework so deeply that contradictions within it feel like paradoxes to be revered, not problems to be solved. But beneath all 12 problems lies a single error, the one Spinoza identified as foundational: anthropomorphization. Christianity requires that we imagine God as a person with intentions, emotions, relationships, a will that can be frustrated or satisfied. This requires that we take the categories of human experience and project them onto the infinite. A person can make choices. Therefore, God makes choices. A person can love. Therefore, God loves. A person can respond to requests. Therefore, God responds to prayer. A person can change their mind. Therefore, God can respond to human circumstances. A person can care about how they are perceived. Therefore, God cares about being worshipped and praised. A person can become angry at betrayal. Therefore, God is angry with sin. None of this survives scrutiny. An infinite being does not make choices in the way finite beings do. An omniscient being cannot change their mind. They already know what will happen. An eternal being does not experience events as occurring, because all moments are equally present to eternity. To speak of God as if he were a person is to speak metaphorically. And metaphor is precisely what Christianity claims not to be doing. It claims its central claims are literal facts. Once you stop anthropomorphizing, the system collapses. What remains is not God, but the bare concept of infinity, necessity, being without personhood. This is closer to Spinoza's God, not a being who intervenes in history, but nature itself, understood in its necessity. Not a being who judges, but the structure of cause and effect. Not a person who loves, but the interconnectedness of all things. A belief does not become sacred by avoiding examination. It becomes fragile. Christianity has endured not because its claims are logically coherent, they are not, but because the institutions that promote it have been powerful enough to make questioning seem irreverent. There is something tragic in this. The questions that reveal Christianity's incoherence are not vicious or cynical. They are the honest questions that anyone serious about truth must ask. To forbid them is not to protect faith. It is to admit that faith cannot withstand scrutiny. It is to cede the essential point before the discussion even begins. There are worldviews that account for existence without requiring contradiction. There are ways to find meaning without requiring that you deny logic. There are systems of ethics that do not depend on the command of a supernatural lawgiver. And there are forms of wonder at the universe that do not require that you believe the impossible. The choice is not between Christian faith and nihilism. It is between taking seriously the principle that what you believe should be what is true, and accepting a comfortable falsehood because it comes dressed in tradition and defended by authority. One path requires intellectual courage. The other requires intellectual surrender. The question is whether your honesty is stronger than your habit.